The courtroom is silent when Kody Brown finally stands up, his hands shaking, his eyes avoiding every woman he once called his wife. What no one realizes yet is that this case isn't just about the law. It's about secrets that were buried for decades, and today they're about to come out. Before we go any further, tell me in the comments, do you think the truth can really survive inside a family built on secrets? The courtroom smells faintly of old wood and polished floors, the kind of place where voices echo even when no one speaks. The lights overhead are too bright, making every expression impossible to hide. Kody sits at the defense table, shoulders stiff, jaw clenched, eyes fixed straight ahead, as if looking at the judge too long might expose something he's been trying to hold together for years. Behind him, the gallery is packed, not with fans, but with tension. You can feel it in the air, thick and uncomfortable, like everyone is holding their breath at the same time. Christine sits 3 rows back, her posture calm, but her hands folded so tightly, her knuckles are white. She looks composed, but her eyes tell a different story. They flick toward Kody, then away again, like she's afraid that if she looks too long, she might say something she can't take back. Janelle is beside her, quieter, observant. She doesn't look angry. She looks prepared, like someone who already accepted the truth, long before the courtroom forced it into words. Mary sits alone, not because there's no space, but because distance has become her shield. Her face is unreadable, but her foot taps against the floor in a rhythm that betrays her nerves. Every tap sounds louder in her own head. And then there's Robin. Robin sits closest to Kody, close enough that their elbows almost touch. Almost. She keeps her gaze low, dabbing at the corner of her eye, like she's been crying all morning, or like she wants everyone to believe she has. The judge enters. Everyone rises. The moment feels heavier than it should, like this isn't just the start of a legal case, but the beginning of something breaking for good. When they sit again, the silence stretches. This case, on paper, is about financial disputes, family contracts, and emotional damages tied to a plural marriage that unraveled publicly. But everyone in that room knows that's not why they're really here. They're here because this family collapsed in front of the world, and now the world wants answers. Christine's attorney stands first. Her voice is steady, practiced, but there's an edge underneath it, like someone holding back years of frustration. She doesn't look at Kody when she begins. She looks at the judge. She talks about promises, about agreements that weren't written down, but were lived every single day, about emotional labor, financial sacrifice, and a system where loyalty was demanded, but protection was optional. Kody shifts in his seat. Christine swallows hard. For just a second, the mask slips. Her eyes glisten, but she doesn't cry. Not yet. Because this isn't the moment for tears. This is the moment for truth. And here's where you should pay close attention. Because what's said next quietly sets the stage for everything that's about to explode. The attorney mentions timelines, moves, money that flowed one direction but never came back. Decisions made for the family that somehow benefited only one household. Robin's head lifts slightly. Kody's jaw tightens. Janelle's eyes narrow just a little. The judge listens without expression, but the room feels like it's leaning forward. Christine is asked to stand. She does. When she speaks, her voice is softer than expected. Not weak, controlled. Like someone who learned the hard way that raising your voice doesn't make you heard. She talks about nights spent alone, while decisions were made without her. About children watching their mother slowly realize she wasn't equal, she was convenient. She pauses once, just once. Her breath catches, and for a second, it looks like she might stop altogether. But then she continues, because stopping now would mean letting the past win. Kody stares straight ahead. He doesn't look at her. Not even when she says his name. Not even when she talks about love turning into obligation. If you think this is just one woman's story, stay with me, because this is only the first crack in a wall that's been standing for decades. The defense responds quickly. They paint Kody as overwhelmed, misunderstood, pulled in too many directions by a structure that was never meant to survive modern life. They say everyone agreed. They say everyone benefited. Christine sits back down. Janelle exhales slowly. Mary looks up for the first time because she knows something no one has said yet. And as the judge calls for a short recess, Kody finally turns his head, just enough to glance toward the women behind him. His eyes pass over Christine, over Janelle. They linger on Mary. And for a split second, something flickers across his face. Fear. Because some stories don't stay buried forever. And when court resumes, one of them is about to be told. What happens next doesn't just change this case. It changes how the entire family is seen forever. The courtroom feels colder when session 2 begins, like the walls themselves are bracing for what's about to be said. And as everyone settles back into their seats, the energy has shifted. This is no longer about contracts or timelines. It's about wounds that never healed. And the first thing you notice is how Mary sits straighter than before. Her earlier hesitation replaced by something sharper, something resolved. Because when her name is called, she doesn't flinch. She stands, smooths her jacket once, and walks to the witness stand with slow, deliberate steps, each one echoing louder than it should. And Kody finally looks at her, really looks at her, and whatever he sees makes his throat tighten, because Mary doesn't look angry, she looks done. And when she begins to speak, her voice isn't loud or dramatic. It's calm in a way that makes every word cut deeper. She talks about the early years first, about believing in the family structure, about sacrifice being framed as love, about loyalty being praised until it became expected. And the courtroom listens as she explains how she followed the rules, even when the rules kept changing, how she stayed quiet when staying quiet felt like survival, and how being the first wife didn't mean being respected. It meant being tested again and again. And right here, listen carefully, because this is the moment where the story stops being about a family and starts being about power. Mary describes moments when decisions were made without her, finances shifted without explanation, emotional distance justified as necessity, and she admits, painfully, that she kept hoping compliance would bring closeness back, but it never did. And as she speaks, Robin's hands twist together in her lap, her breathing visibly uneven, because Mary's words are circling closer to something unspoken, something everyone in that room feels, but no one has named yet. And then it happens. Mary pauses, looks directly at the judge, and says that she was encouraged, subtly, repeatedly, to accept less, to accept loneliness as part of her role, to accept being sidelined for the sake of peace. And Kody shifts again. His attorney leans toward him, whispers something urgent, but it's too late, because Mary isn't accusing him with rage, she's exposing him with clarity, and clarity is harder to fight. If you've ever wondered how quiet pain can be more devastating than loud anger, don't look away now, The defense tries to redirect, asking about consent, about agreement, about shared responsibility. But Mary answers without hesitation, saying agreement requires honesty, and honesty was selective. And that line lands like a crack through glass. Because now the room understands this wasn't chaos. It was control disguised as structure. And then Christine is called back briefly, not to testify again, but to confirm something Mary has just revealed. And Christine nods, her voice barely above a whisper, when she confirms that conversations happened privately, that expectations were framed as moral obligations, and that dissent was labeled as betrayal. And Janelle, watching this unfold, presses her lips together. Stop, break. Peep, break, peep, break, peep, break, peep, break, peep, break, peep, break, peep, break. Because she's remembering her own moments of doubt. Moments she buried under practicality and logic. Moments where numbers made more sense than emotions. Because emotions were too dangerous to confront. Stay with me here, because what Janelle realizes in this moment changes everything that comes next. The judge calls for a short pause, but the tension doesn't break. It thickens, because during the pause, Kody leans toward Robin, his voice low, urgent, and Robin shakes her head slightly, tears pooling but not falling, as if she's trying to hold the narrative together with sheer will. And when proceedings resume, the focus shifts, subtly but unmistakably, toward Robin, not as a villain, but as a pivot point, because questions arise about resource distribution, about emotional prioritization, about how one household seemed consistently protected while others absorbed the strain. And Robin is asked to clarify, her voice trembling as she insists she never asked for more, that she only wanted harmony, that she felt blamed for dynamics she didn't create. But the problem is, her words don't align with the timeline, and the judge notices, the attorneys notice, the audience notices. And this is where the story takes a turn that no one in that room expected, because Janelle's attorney introduces records, not aggressively, not dramatically, just quietly, methodically, documents showing patterns, showing how financial decisions consistently favored one direction. And Janelle is called to speak. And when she does, her tone is measured, almost clinical, but the emotion is there, simmering beneath the surface. She explains how she handled the numbers because someone had to, how she justified imbalance because stability mattered more than fairness. Never breaking. This moment will change your mind. Kody finally speaks then, interrupting through his attorney, insisting he was trying to keep everyone afloat, insisting the system collapsed under pressure, not intention. But as he speaks, his words sound rehearsed, detached, and the judge raises a hand, signaling restraint, signaling order, but also signaling something else, skepticism. Because intent doesn't erase impact, and the courtroom feels smaller now, tighter, like the walls are closing in on the version of the story Kody has told for years. And as session 2 draws toward its end, Mary glances back once, her eyes meeting Christine's. And in that look, there's understanding, maybe even forgiveness. And Christine nods almost imperceptibly, because they both know this isn't over, not even close. Remember this feeling, because the next session takes this quiet reckoning and turns it into something far more explosive. The judge announces an adjournment, but before the gavel falls, one final statement is entered into record. A notice that additional testimony has been requested. Testimony that may redefine the nature of the family agreements entirely. And as everyone rises, Kody remains seated for half a second too long, staring at the table in front of him. Because for the first time, the story is no longer his to control, and whatever comes next will force every truth into the light, whether he's ready for it or not. P break 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 break. P break 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 break. P break 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 break. P break 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 break. The third session opens with a tension so sharp it feels like it could cut through the air itself. And the moment the judge takes the bench, everyone senses this is where things stop being restrained and start becoming raw, because today isn't about documents or timelines anymore. It's about memory, emotion, and the parts of the story that were never meant to be spoken out loud. And the first sign of that shift comes when the court calls for testimony related to emotional coercion. A phrase simple enough to sound harmless, yet heavy enough to make Kody's shoulders stiffen immediately. And as murmurs ripple quietly through the room, Christine is asked to return to the stand. And this time, when she rises, there's no hesitation at all, no pause to steady herself. She walks forward like someone who has already made peace with the consequences of telling the truth. And when she sits, she looks directly at Kody for the first time since the trial began. Not with anger, not with bitterness, but with a calm that feels far more dangerous, because calm means she's no longer afraid. And when she starts speaking, her voice carries a steadiness that draws the entire courtroom in. She talks about years spent convincing herself that discomfort was normal, that jealousy was weakness, that loneliness was something she needed to fix within herself. And she explains how often she was reminded, not explicitly, but constantly, that questioning the structure meant questioning the family's values, and that questioning the family's values meant putting everyone at risk. And this is the moment you need to hold on to, because this is where emotional pressure becomes emotional prison. Christine describes moments that seem small on the surface. Conversations held behind closed doors, looks exchanged that silence dissent, praise given selectively and withdrawn without explanation. And she admits that over time, she stopped speaking up, not because she agreed, but because resistance came at a cost she couldn't afford to pay anymore. And the courtroom listens in absolute silence as she recounts nights spent rehearsing conversations in her head, only to abandon them because the outcome was always the same. Dismissal disguised as patience, authority disguised as concern. And as she speaks, Robin's composure begins to crack. Her breathing becomes uneven. Her hands tremble in her lap. And when Christine mentions how certain emotions were labeled as disruptive, while others were rewarded, Robin shakes her head faintly, whispering something under her breath that no one else can hear. But the tension escalates when Christine is asked directly whether she felt free to leave the marriage at any point, and she doesn't answer right away. She looks down, inhales slowly, and then says no, not because she was physically stopped, but because she was emotionally convinced that leaving would destroy not just her, but everyone else too. Strong, if you've ever wondered how someone can feel trapped without a locked door, this is it. And the weight of that statement settles heavily over the room. Even the judge shifts slightly in his chair, because this is no longer abstract. This is human. And then the defense stands, attempting to reframe, suggesting Christine's feelings were subjective, that emotional strain is inevitable in complex relationships, that discomfort doesn't equal wrongdoing. But Christine doesn't argue. She simply nods and responds that complexity doesn't excuse harm, and that line lands with quiet force, because it's not dramatic. It's undeniable. And then something unexpected happens. Janelle asks to speak, not through her attorney, but directly. And when permission is granted, she stands slowly, her voice steady, but layered with emotion. She's kept tightly controlled, until now. She explains how she always positioned herself as the logical one, the practical one, the one who didn't need emotional reassurance because numbers and stability made sense to her. Until she realized that logic had become her armor, a way to avoid admitting that she too had been shaped by the same pressure, the same unspoken rules. And she confesses that watching Christine speak forces her to confront something she avoided for years, that being strong didn't protect her from being influenced. It just made the influence harder to see. Stay with me here, because this realization changes how the entire story is understood. And as Janelle speaks, Mary watches intently, her expression softening, because she recognizes the moment when denial finally loosens its grip. And then the courtroom's attention shifts to Robin, not by choice, but by necessity, because questions are now unavoidable. Questions about how emotional validation flowed, about who was comforted and who was corrected, about who was allowed to be vulnerable and who was expected to endure. And when Robin is finally asked to respond, she stands slowly, visibly shaken, tears finally spilling over as she insists she never intended to benefit from anyone else's pain, that she often felt overwhelmed, that she believed she was helping by encouraging unity. But the problem isn't her emotion, it's her explanation. Because as she speaks, contradictions surface. Moments where her words don't align with previous testimony, where timelines blur, where intent feels disconnected from outcome. And the judge notices, his questions becoming more pointed, more precise, and Robin falters, pausing mid-sentence more than once. This is where sympathy and scrutiny collide, and the courtroom feels that collision deeply, because it's possible to feel compassion for someone while still questioning their role. And as Robin struggles to articulate her position, Kody finally reacts, shifting forward, whispering urgently to his attorney, his composure cracking just enough to reveal panic beneath it. And when his attorney attempts to intervene, the judge raises a hand, allowing Robin to finish. But the damage is already done, because uncertainty has entered the narrative, and uncertainty is dangerous in a courtroom built on credibility. And as Session 3 pushes forward, the emotional temperature rises further when Christine is asked one final question, whether she believes the family structure could have survived without fear. And she answers simply that fear was the structure, and that line hangs in the air like a verdict waiting to be delivered. Remember this moment, because everything after this is fallout. The judge calls for order as murmurs ripple through the gallery, and when the session finally adjourns, there's no sense of relief, only anticipation, because what's been revealed can't be taken back. Alliances have shifted. Perceptions have cracked, and the foundation of the story Kody relied on is visibly crumbling. And as everyone rises to leave, Kody remains seated again, staring straight ahead, not at his wives, not at the judge, but at something internal, something unraveling. Because he knows that the next session won't just question his decisions, it will challenge his identity. And whatever comes next will force him to answer, not just to the court, but to himself. When Session 4 begins, the courtroom no longer feels like a place of order, but like a pressure chamber, sealed tight with truths that have nowhere left to go. And the moment the judge takes the bench, Kody finally stands, not because he's been called yet, but because something in him seems to realize that if he doesn't speak now, the story will move forward without him. And when he's instructed to sit back down, the look on his face isn't defiance, it's desperation. Because this is the session where the narrative turns inward, where intention is weighed against consequence, and the court calls for Kody's testimony. And as he walks to the stand, the room watches him differently now. No longer as the center of a complicated family, but as the common thread in every account of harm. And when he sits, adjusts the microphone, clears his throat, there's a long pause where it feels like he might finally say something unrehearsed, something real. But instead, he begins with a familiar defense, talking about pressure, about responsibility, about being pulled apart by competing needs. And his voice carries frustration more than remorse, which immediately shifts the energy in the room, because frustration suggests burden, not accountability. And as he explains his vision of leadership, of structure, of sacrifice, the judge listens closely, occasionally glancing down at notes that now include words like emotional leverage and patterned behavior. And when Kody says he never forced anyone to stay, never intended to isolate anyone emotionally. Period break, 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 period break. Christine's breath catches audibly because intention has become the shield he's hiding behind. And this is where you need to stay focused, because what sounds reasonable on the surface starts to unravel under scrutiny. The questioning turns precise, asking Kody to explain why emotional reassurance was offered selectively, why dissent was met with moral framing, why leaving was described not as a choice, but as a threat to family stability. And with each question, Kody's answers grow longer, more circular, less grounded, until he begins contradicting himself, claiming openness while describing consequences for non-compliance, describing love while defining it in terms of loyalty. And the courtroom senses it all at once. This isn't confusion, it's rationalization, and the judge leans forward slightly, signaling that patience is thinning. And then, something unexpected happens. The court introduces a recorded statement, not audio, but a written message from years earlier, one Kody sent during a family conflict, and as it's read aloud, the language is unmistakable, framing obedience as commitment, disagreement as betrayal, unity as silence, and Kody's face drains of color, because this isn't interpretation, it's his own words. If you've ever wondered how past choices come back when you least expect them, this is that moment. Robin shifts uncomfortably, her earlier tears replaced by a fixed stare, because she recognizes the language too, language she once believed was about protection. And as the judge asks Kody to respond, he hesitates, searching for a justification that won't sound hollow. But the room is no longer giving him that space, because now the story has receipts, and Christine is allowed a brief response, not to attack, but to contextualize. And she explains how messages like that shaped behavior, how they taught her what was safe to feel and what wasn't, how love became conditional without ever being labeled that way. And as she speaks, her voice trembles not with fear, but with the weight of realizing how long she lived inside those conditions. Stay with me here, because this is the emotional center of everything. Janelle is then asked to clarify financial decisions that intersected with emotional expectations, and she explains how monetary stability was often used to justify emotional imbalance, how resources followed harmony, and harmony meant agreement. And for the first time, the court begins to see how deeply intertwined the systems were. Emotional compliance reinforcing financial flow reinforcing emotional hierarchy. And the judge asks a simple question that lands like a shockwave: whether anyone ever explicitly said no. And the answer, across testimonies, is the same. No, because no wasn't an option that felt survivable. And the silence after that answer is profound, because it reframes everything. And then Robin is recalled, not to defend, but to clarify her role in reinforcing or challenging those dynamics. And when she speaks this time, her voice is quieter, less defensive. She admits she often deferred to Kody's framing of unity, that she believed supporting him meant supporting the family, and that in hindsight, she sees how that may have amplified harm rather than softened it. And tears fall freely now, not performative, but heavy, because this admission costs her something too. This is where blame becomes complicated, and accountability becomes shared. Kody reacts visibly, shaking his head, whispering that he was trying to protect everyone. But the judge stops him, reminding him that protection without consent becomes control. And that line seems to hit him harder than anything else said so far, because it strips away the hero narrative he's been clinging to. And as the session moves toward its close, the court introduces the possibility of redefining the family agreements not as equal partnerships, but as hierarchies maintained through emotional pressure. And that suggestion alone changes the stakes of the entire case, because it opens the door to consequences far beyond what anyone anticipated. And as the judge announces adjournment, the atmosphere isn't tense anymore, it's charged, like something irreversible has just been set in motion. And Kody remains seated once again, his hands clasped tightly, staring at the witness stand he just left. Because for the first time, the question isn't whether the family failed, it's whether he understands why. Remember this feeling, because the next session doesn't just examine the past, it delivers the fallout. And as everyone files out, Christine pauses briefly near the exit, her face a mix of exhaustion and relief, because speaking the truth didn't heal everything, but it cracked the silence wide open. And whatever comes next will have to grow in that space. Session 5 begins with a strange calm that feels almost unsettling after the emotional storm of the previous day. The kind of quiet that settles in only after something irreversible has already happened. And as the courtroom fills again, there's a noticeable shift in how everyone moves. Slower, more deliberate, like they all understand that this session isn't about discovering new pain, but about reckoning with what's already been exposed. And the judge opens by stating that today's focus will be impact, not intent. A single sentence that lands heavily, because it reframes everything that came before, and Kody stiffens immediately, because intent has been his refuge, the place he keeps retreating to when consequences feel too heavy to carry. And when the first witness is called, it isn't one of the wives. It's a family counselor who worked with them years earlier, someone whose presence instantly adds a layer of credibility that no personal testimony ever could. And as she takes the stand, her tone is calm, professional, but unmistakably careful, because she understands the weight of what she's about to say. She talks about patterns, about dynamics observed over time, about how certain voices dominated decision-making while others slowly withdrew, not because they lacked opinions, but because expressing them became emotionally costly. And as she explains how emotional hierarchies form in families without anyone consciously designing them, the courtroom listens with a different kind of attention, because this isn't accusation, it's analysis. And this is where the story shifts from who hurt whom to how the system itself caused damage. Prom. Save all and die. Next, the story shifts from who hurt whom to how the system itself caused damage. Thank you. In this podcast, we entertain one of the most important concepts, professionally and ethically. I am present as you and your team. Prom day. I'm doing this for you. That dream, Laby, will not be impossible if you keep doing it. I am deeply proud of my accomplishments. I'm proud of the team's depth and resources. If you build the business, next week, we have time to promote relevant content. If you remember my unblocking full, we can find ways to expand and shape the business offerings and add them squarely to the comprehensive list of qualifiers. let's get the ball rolling. The story shifts from who hurt whom to how the system itself caused damage. The story shifts from who hurt whom to how the system itself caused damage. We prize our common belief and institutions. We take responsibility for only being a part of a complex action we carry out in organizational norms and cultures. The goal of this story begins with respectful confrontation. She explains that in structures where authority is framed as moral leadership, dissent often becomes internalized as guilt, and those who adapt quickest are rewarded with closeness and reassurance, while those who struggle are labeled as resistant or disruptive. And as she speaks, Robin's face tightens, because the description sounds uncomfortably familiar. And Christine lowers her gaze, because hearing it described clinically doesn't lessen the pain, it sharpens it. And when the counselor is asked whether these dynamics can exist without malicious intent, she answers yes, but adds that harm doesn't require malice. It only requires imbalance. And that sentence seems to echo through the room, because it validates pain without demonizing intention, something no one has managed to do so far. If you've ever felt confused about how love and harm can exist in the same place, this moment explains it. And when the counselor steps down, the judge turns to the wives, asking if they wish to respond, and Christine does, but briefly, saying that hearing her experience reflected back without blame feels both relieving and devastating, because it confirms she wasn't imagining it. And Janelle follows, admitting that she hid behind rationality because logic felt safer than vulnerability, and that she now sees how that choice protected the system more than it protected herself. And Mary speaks last, her voice steady but weighted, saying that she learned to measure her worth by how little trouble she caused, and that realization still makes her uncomfortable, because it reveals how deeply the dynamic shaped her identity. And as these admissions unfold, the courtroom's attention slowly shifts toward Kody again, not with hostility, but with expectation, because this is the moment where accountability either deepens or collapses. And when he's invited to respond, he stands slowly, his movements less rigid than before, his expression strained in a different way, like someone realizing that defending himself isn't the same as understanding the damage. And when he speaks, his voice cracks almost immediately, not with tears, but with frustration at himself. He says he thought leadership meant making hard choices, that he believed unity required firmness, that he didn't realize how often firmness crossed into pressure. And for the first time, his words don't sound rehearsed. They sound searching, uncertain, and that uncertainty shifts the room again. Stay with me here, because this is where everything could change or fall apart completely. The judge asks a simple but devastating question: whether Kody would have acted differently had he known the impact. And Kody hesitates too long, because the honest answer is complicated. And in that hesitation, everyone sees the struggle between ego and reflection. And when he finally answers that he doesn't know, the courtroom reacts with a quiet murmur, because not knowing feels insufficient. After so much harm, and Christine's face hardens slightly. Not in anger, but in resignation, because she's reached the point where uncertainty no longer feels like progress. And the judge presses further, asking whether Kody acknowledges that his leadership style created an environment where leaving felt impossible. And this time, P, Kody nods, slowly, reluctantly, but clearly. And that nod feels like the first real concession of the entire trial. Remember this nod, because it carries more weight than any argument. The atmosphere shifts again when the discussion turns toward the children, not individually, but as witnesses to the dynamic. And although no children testify, the acknowledgement alone is powerful, because it introduces a generational dimension to the harm. And Janelle's composure finally cracks here, her voice breaking as she admits that she prioritized stability so fiercely that she sometimes ignored what stability was costing her kids emotionally. And Christine reaches for her hand instinctively, a small gesture that says more than words ever could. And Robin, watching this exchange, begins to cry openly, not defensively, but with a grief that seems rooted in regret, because she realizes that benefiting from a system doesn't mean being protected from its consequences. If you think emotional fallout only hits the people who leave, this is where that belief breaks. The judge then outlines possible outcomes, not as threats, but as realities: redefined agreements, financial restitution, formal acknowledgement of emotional harm. And each option carries weight, because they all require someone to accept responsibility beyond apology. And as Session 5 moves toward its end, there's a sense that the courtroom itself is holding its breath, waiting to see whether this reckoning will lead to repair or simply mark the end. And in the final moments, the judge announces that the next session will focus on resolution, but warns that resolution doesn't always mean reconciliation. And that line lands with quiet finality, because it forces everyone to confront what they're actually hoping for. And as people begin to rise, Kody remains seated yet again, but this time, his posture is different, less defensive, more collapsed, like the weight he's been avoiding has finally settled on his shoulders, and Christine pauses near him briefly, not to comfort, not to accuse, but to acknowledge. And in that brief exchange of glances, there's no forgiveness, no anger, just understanding that some truths arrive too late to fix everything. Hold on to this moment, because what comes next isn't about who was right. It's about what happens when the truth finally has nowhere left to hide. And as the courtroom empties, the quiet left behind feels heavier than any argument, because silence, once broken, never returns the same way. Session 6 opens with a weight that feels almost physical, like the courtroom itself is tired of holding so much history. And as everyone takes their seats, there's a quiet understanding that this is the point where stories stop circling and start landing somewhere real. Because today isn't about proving what happened anymore. It's about deciding what it means. And the judge begins by summarizing what's been established so far: emotional pressure, financial imbalance, leadership framed as morality, silence rewarded more than honesty, and hearing it spoken aloud in one continuous thread makes the room feel smaller, tighter, because the pattern is now undeniable. And when the judge asks whether there are any final testimonies before deliberation begins, there's a pause so long it feels intentional, until Mary unexpectedly raises her hand, and the shift is immediate, because Mary has already spoken her truth. But what she asks for now isn't testimony. It's permission to explain the cost of staying silent for so long. And when she's allowed to speak, her voice is steady, but layered with something fragile, something raw. She talks about identity erosion, about how over time she stopped recognizing herself outside of her role. Brer, brer. About how being loyal became more important than being whole. And she admits that even now, part of her feels guilty for speaking, because guilt was the language she was taught to understand best. And right here, listen closely, because this is where emotional damage becomes visible. Not dramatic, but deeply human. She explains how silence doesn't feel like peace. It feels like disappearance. And as she speaks, Christine's eyes fill with tears. Not because the words are new, but because hearing them spoken without apology feels like reclaiming something that was lost. And Janelle nods slowly, her face tight with recognition, because she understands now that practicality didn't protect her from loss. It just delayed the grief. And when Mary finishes, the room is still, not heavy, but reverent, like everyone knows they've just witnessed something irreversible. And then the judge turns to Robin, not to question her actions this time, but to ask whether she understands how her position within the family affected the others. And Robin inhales sharply before answering, because this isn't about defense anymore. It's about reckoning. And when she speaks, her voice is quieter than it's ever been. Stripped of urgency, stripped of justification. She says she believed being supported meant being right. That reassurance felt like validation, and she didn't question why it flowed more easily to her than to the others. And she admits that comfort can become blinding, that being protected insulated her from seeing the imbalance clearly. Stay with me here, because this is the moment where self-awareness finally enters the room. And as Robin speaks, there's no backlash, no interruption, just listening, because accountability, when it's real, doesn't need resistance to be powerful. And Kody watches her with an expression that's hard to read, something between regret and recognition, because her words are describing a dynamic he created, but never examined. And when it's his turn again, the judge doesn't ask about leadership or intent. He asks about responsibility, asking Kody whether he accepts that the environment he maintained caused lasting harm, regardless of intention. And this time, there's no hesitation, no circular explanation. Kody nods slowly and says yes, and the simplicity of that answer sends a quiet ripple through the room, because it's the first time he's responded without protecting himself. Remember this answer, because it's the closest thing to a turning point this story has. But acknowledgement doesn't erase consequence, and the judge makes that clear by outlining what accountability may look like. Not punishment for its own sake, but corrective action, recognition of emotional damages, restructured agreements, and clear boundaries moving forward. And as these possibilities are discussed, the courtroom feels suspended between past and future, because every option represents not just an outcome. Breakdown in the break pause, 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 but an ending. And Christine is asked how she feels hearing this, and her response is soft but firm. She says that accountability matters, but freedom mattered more, and that she doesn't need validation to know she made the right choice leaving. And that statement lands quietly but decisively, because it reframes healing as self-defined, not court-granted. And Janelle follows, admitting that while she stayed longer, she understands now that endurance isn't the same as consent. And that realization has forced her to reevaluate what strength actually looks like. And Mary adds that speaking didn't fix everything, but it gave her something she hadn't felt in years: presence. And that word lingers, because presence is what the system slowly stripped away. If you've ever wondered what healing really sounds like, this is it. Quiet, imperfect, but honest. The judge then announces a brief recess before final statements, and during this pause, something subtle but important happens. Christine and Robin exchange a look across the room. Not hostile, not warm, just acknowledging. Because whatever their differences, they both lived inside the same structure, and both were shaped by it in different ways. And when the court reconvenes, final statements begin. But they aren't fiery or dramatic. They're reflective, because the evidence doesn't need persuasion anymore. It needs interpretation. And Christine's attorney speaks about autonomy, about how leaving wasn't abandonment, but self-preservation. And Janelle's attorney emphasizes systemic imbalance over individual blame. And Mary's attorney speaks about emotional labor and invisibility. And when Kody's attorney speaks, The tone is noticeably different than earlier sessions, less defensive, more conciliatory, acknowledging harm while asking the court to consider growth as part of accountability. And as all of this unfolds, the courtroom feels less like a battlefield and more like a reckoning space, where outcomes matter, but understanding matters too. Stay with me, because this is where resolution starts to take shape, even if it doesn't look like anyone expected. And in the final moments of Session 6, the judge announces that deliberation will begin, but also states that whatever the court decides, the emotional truth has already been established. And that line feels like closure and beginning at the same time, because it confirms what everyone in the room already knows. The family as it was no longer exists, and never will again. And as people rise to leave, there's no rush, no tension-filled exit, just quiet movement. Because some endings don't explode, they settle. And Kody remains seated one last time. But this time, he isn't staring at the table or the stand. He's staring at nothing, processing the realization that leadership without listening isn't leadership at all. And as the courtroom empties, the silence left behind doesn't feel empty. It feels final. Hold on to this silence, because the next session doesn't ask what happened. It asks what happens now. Parentheses, parentheses, parentheses. Session 7 begins with a stillness that feels heavier than any argument so far, because this is the day where waiting becomes unbearable, and silence starts to feel like its own verdict. And as everyone returns to the courtroom, there's a sense that no one is sitting in the same emotional seat they occupied before. Not Kody, not the wives, not even the people watching quietly from the gallery, because something fundamental has already shifted. And when the judge enters, the sound of everyone standing feels slower, more deliberate, as if time itself has thickened. And the judge begins by reminding everyone that deliberation is not just about assigning fault, but about defining reality going forward. And that sentence alone tightens Kody's jaw, because reality going forward is the one thing he's never been able to fully control. And the judge announces that before a final ruling is delivered, the court will allow one final opportunity for direct statements, not arguments, not testimony, but reflections, and the room reacts almost imperceptibly because reflection requires honesty without defense. And the first person invited to speak is Christine, who stands slowly, her movements calm, grounded, like someone who has already crossed the most difficult emotional terrain. And when she begins, her voice is steady, not dramatic, not pleading. She says that for a long time, she believed enduring discomfort was proof of love. And that belief kept her tethered to a situation that slowly erased her joy, her sense of self, and her ability to trust her own feelings. And she admits that leaving wasn't brave in the moment. It was terrifying. But staying had become more terrifying than the unknown. And this is where her story stops being about leaving and starts being about choosing life. She looks briefly toward Kody then, not accusingly, but with a kind of sadness that feels deeper than anger. And she says that accountability matters, but it doesn't. Undo the years she spent believing her needs were unreasonable. And she ends by saying that freedom, for her, means never having to justify her pain again. And when she sits, the room feels quieter than before, because her words didn't demand anything. They simply defined a boundary. And then Janelle is invited to speak. And when she stands, there's a visible hesitation, not from fear, but from the weight of realizing how much she still needs to unlearn. And she talks about practicality, about how she always believed being logical made her strong. But she now understands that logic became a way to avoid asking hard emotional questions, especially when the answers might disrupt stability. And she admits that she stayed not because she was fulfilled, but because she was afraid of what instability might do to her children, her finances, her identity. And saying that out loud cracks something open in her, her voice wavering just enough to reveal how much she's been holding together for years. Strong, because this is where quiet endurance finally speaks. 2. Pause. Still. Never gone beyond. Hopes instead. Hend eni. As go. Qua. Ase. Pa. Sto. She says she doesn't regret valuing stability, but she regrets believing it had to come at the cost of her own voice. And when she sits, Mary is already standing, almost instinctively, like she's been waiting for this moment longer than anyone realizes. And Mary speaks with a calm that feels earned, not rehearsed. She says that being the first wife taught her how to lead without power, how to sacrifice without recognition, and how to disappear without leaving. And she admits that for years, she believed her value was measured by how little space she took up. And that belief shaped every choice she made, every silence she maintained. And she says that speaking now doesn't erase the loneliness she lived with, but it does give that loneliness a name. And naming it feels like reclaiming a piece of herself she thought was gone forever. If you've ever felt invisible in a room full of people, this moment is for you. And when Mary sits, Robin is invited to speak last among the wives, and the shift is immediate, because Robin's role has been the most complicated, the most contested, and as she stands, she looks genuinely uncertain, not about what to say, but about how it will be received. And when she speaks, her voice trembles, but not from fear, from recognition. She says she entered the family believing love could multiply without loss, that she trusted the structure because it promised security, and she admits that being prioritized felt validating, especially when she was told it was for the good of everyone, and she confesses that she didn't question that validation enough, because it felt like finally being chosen, and that desire to be chosen blinded her to the cost others were paying, and tears fall freely now, not defensively, but with grief, because she realizes that benefiting from imbalance doesn't mean she wasn't also shaped by it. Strongly, this is where empathy becomes uncomfortable but necessary. And when she finishes, all eyes turn to Kody, because this is the moment everyone has been waiting for. The moment where reflection can no longer be shared or redirected. And when Kody stands, the room feels tight again, like everyone is bracing for impact. And he starts slowly, admitting that hearing each of them speak has forced him to confront versions of himself he avoided for years. Versions that equated leadership with authority, love with loyalty, and unity with silence. And he admits that he believed keeping the family together meant making decisions that others would eventually understand. And he says now that belief feels hollow, because understanding doesn't grow where voices are suppressed. And for the first time, his voice breaks, not with anger, not with defensiveness, but with something close to remorse. And this is the moment where the story could still turn. Said, period. Quote, period. Quote, period. Quote, period. Quote, period. Quote, period. 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 He acknowledges that he benefited from the system, that he was rarely the one sacrificing comfort, and that power insulated him from recognizing how deeply others were struggling. And he admits that control felt easier than vulnerability. And that choice cost him more than he realized, because it destroyed trust. And trust, once broken, doesn't rebuild on intention alone. And as he speaks, the courtroom listens without interruption. Because this isn't a defense, it's a confession. And when he finishes, there's no dramatic reaction, no gasp, just a heavy silence. Because confession doesn't guarantee forgiveness. It only creates the possibility of understanding. And the judge takes a moment before speaking again, acknowledging the gravity of what's been shared, and stating that the court's role now is to formalize accountability in a way that honors the truth, without pretending it can repair everything. And that statement reframes expectations, because no one is leaving here with a clean resolution. And as the judge announces that the final ruling will be delivered in the next session, the room feels suspended between relief and dread, because endings carry their own kind of fear. And as people begin to rise, Christine doesn't rush out. Janelle pauses to steady herself. Mary exhales like she's been holding her breath for years. Robin wipes her eyes slowly, and Kody remains standing, staring at the bench, absorbing the reality that whatever comes next will define not just the case, but the legacy of the family he once believed he was protecting. Hold on to this moment, because the next session doesn't just deliver a decision, it delivers consequences, and not everyone will walk away the same. Session 8 begins with a quiet so complete it feels ceremonial. The kind of silence that settles when everyone knows this is the final chapter, and there will be no rewrites, no pauses, no returning to what was. And as the judge enters for the last time, the room rises almost mechanically, then sits again, hearts pounding beneath composed faces, because this isn't just a ruling, it's a reckoning. And the judge opens by acknowledging the extraordinary nature of the case, not because it involved a public family, but because it exposed how emotional power can operate invisibly inside systems built on trust. And as he speaks, Kody's gaze stays fixed forward, his expression unreadable but tense, while Christine sits upright, calm but resolute, Janelle's hands folded tightly, Mary's posture still and contained, and Robin's eyes already shining with unshed tears. And then the ruling begins, slowly, deliberately, outlining how the court recognizes that while no one was physically restrained, emotional pressure functioned as a limiting force, shaping choices, narrowing exits, and redefining consent over time. Brackets, 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 brackets. And the judge continues, ordering formal recognition of emotional harm, restructuring of financial obligations to reflect imbalance, and a clear declaration that no party is required to maintain emotional or relational ties in the name of unity. And that line hits like a quiet explosion, because it validates what Christine already chose, what Janelle has been questioning, what Mary has struggled to believe, and what Robin now understands too late. Remember this moment, because this sentence changes the meaning of freedom for every person in that room. Kody exhales sharply when the ruling addresses him directly, stating that leadership without mutual accountability becomes coercive, regardless of intent, and that acknowledging harm is not the end of responsibility, but the beginning of repair, if repair is even possible. And Kody nods slowly, absorbing the weight of being seen clearly for the first time, not as a villain, not as a hero, but as a man whose choices shaped lives in ways he never fully confronted. And as the judge finishes reading, the courtroom remains silent for several long seconds, because no one knows how to react when the truth finally settles. And then the judge adds something unexpected, something not required by law, but offered as reflection, stating that healing does not require reconciliation, and that sometimes the most ethical outcome is separation with honesty. And that line shifts something deep in the room. If you've ever stayed somewhere out of obligation instead of love, this is where that belief breaks. And with that, the gavel comes down. Not loud, not dramatic, but final. And the sound echoes longer than it should, marking the end of the case and the end of an era. And slowly, people begin to move, but not rush, because leaving this room means stepping into a future no one fully planned for. And Christine stands first, her movements confident, grounded, and when she turns to leave, there's no backward glance. No hesitation, just forward motion, because her story no longer lives here. And Janelle follows, pausing briefly as if to steady herself, then lifting her head with quiet determination. Because stability now means something different than it once did. And Mary rises last among them, taking a deep breath before standing, her face calm but changed, like someone who finally knows she exists beyond her role. And Robin remains seated for a moment longer, tears falling freely now, not from accusation, but from grief, because gaining clarity doesn't spare you from loss. And when she finally stands, she looks toward Christine instinctively, then stops herself, realizing that some bridges don't rebuild, they simply end. Stay with me, because this ending matters more than any fight. And Kody remains alone at the table as the courtroom empties, not frozen, not defiant, just still, absorbing the reality that control never equals connection, and that leadership without listening costs more than it gives. And as he finally stands, the room is nearly empty, sunlight streaming through the high windows, dust motes floating in the air, making everything feel strangely quiet and ordinary after so much intensity. And that contrast feels fitting, because life doesn't explode after truth is spoken. It continues, altered but ongoing. And outside the courtroom, no cameras rush forward, no dramatic confrontations unfold. Just space, open and uncertain. And Christine steps into it without fear. Janelle with cautious resolve, Mary with reclaimed presence, Robin with complicated grief, and Kody with a legacy forever changed. And the story doesn't end with forgiveness or punishment. It ends with clarity, the kind that arrives late but stays forever. Hold on to this feeling, because this is what closure actually looks like. Not neat, not perfect, but honest. And before you go, I want to ask you something directly, because this story isn't just about them. It's about all of us. If you were in their place, would you choose comfort, loyalty, or truth? And why? Tell me in the comments, because your answer might say more than you realize.